Hi everyone and welcome to another video. In this video I'm going to show you how to bake your sourdough bread using the two-pan method. Now if you've heard about this method you probably know what this is about, but I'll still quickly go through the basics and then I will show you in practice how to actually do it. For the two-pan method you need 2 loaf pans. I use those ones. I will link them in the description down below. I absolutely love them because I think they are the perfect size. They are not non-stick, but that's why we're using parchment paper, or you can just spray them with a little bit of olive oil spray. That works great as well. Basically, the point of the two-pan method is to create the environment that Dutch ovens create for sourdough bread baking. So that means if you put your sourdough loaf into one pan and cover it with another, you are basically creating your mini Dutch oven. So you are trapping the steam inside, which really helps with an oven rise. It really helps with developing that crispy crust with lots of bubbles on the bread. And the great thing about this method is that it saves you money to buy a Dutch oven, which is usually more expensive than just 2 loaf pans, but it also creates more space in your oven. So maybe you have a micro bakery and you need to bake a lot of loaves at once, or you have a big family gathering. You can put, I don't know, 6, 8 loaves of bread in your oven at the same time, which is not possible with Dutch ovens, obviously. I still use my Dutch oven a lot, but lately I've been baking in those 2 pans a lot too, because especially if you're doing inclusions in your bread, it can be really practical to just line those pans with some parchment paper, and then if inclusions do end up bursting out of the bread a bit, you have a smaller mess to clean than if you would put them into a Dutch oven. The dough we're going to use for the bread today is actually already bulk fermenting on my counter right behind me, but I will take you through the whole process and include a lot of explanation. And as always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below and I'll make sure to answer them all. Now let's get to it. The great thing about the two-pan method is that you can still adjust the size of the loaf you're baking. In the pans I'm using, I typically make loaves with 400 grams of flour, but I've also tried loaves ranging from 3 to 500 grams and they all turn out great. Here I'm starting out by measuring all the ingredients, and I'll link the recipe I'm using down below so you can print it out if you'd like, but basically we're starting this bread just as we would with any other sourdough loaf. The process up until the shaping is exactly the same as it is for a standard sourdough baked in any other shape. When I'm mixing sourdough without a stand mixer, which is usually for all plain sourdough bread, I really like to mix starter, water and salt really well together, because I have a feeling that especially if you're using a starter that's a little more thick, which I like to do, it really helps to get starter dissolved into water, and that way your dough will rise more evenly because starter will be more evenly dispersed through the dough. And another note, if you've watched my previous videos, you already know this, but I still like to emphasize it because so many people think they need a lot of tools to make sourdough, but actually you really don't. I prefer, for example, mixing the dough only with my kitchen spoon. So that means I don't use my hands because I don't like the mess and the dough sticks to your hands a lot when you're initially mixing it. You really just need your spoon. And if you look at this video, I'm kind of just mixing everything together, making sure that I really scrape down the sides because that is important. But that's basically it. I find that after half an hour, after the flour had a chance to absorb all the water, the dough becomes really uniform, and after a few series of stretch and folds, it also becomes really pliable, flexible, elastic, smooth, everything that you want your dough to be, and this kind of dough will bake into beautiful bread. Regarding stretch and folds, I usually like to do 3 rounds of stretch and folds, That's why my recipes almost always call for 3 rounds, but you can get away with 2. You can do 4 if you feel like the dough is still not very elastic and it still tears when you try to stretch it. But as I said, the number of sets is not as important. Even the timing of sets of stretch and folds is not as important as some recipes make it to be. I do like to do them in the first 2 hours after mixing up the dough, so that's why I usually write in the recipe that I recommend doing them about every 30 minutes or so, just to let the dough have uninterrupted bulk ferment after that. After the bulk fermentation, which takes me around 6 to 8 hours for this recipe in my kitchen, I like to pre-shape the dough. Now, pre-shaping is a step that I honestly usually skip if I'm just baking a normal sourdough boule. But if I want a certain shape, like for example now we need to shape the dough into a loaf shape, I feel like pre-shaping really does make a difference. It makes the dough lose its stickiness even more, it becomes more elastic, smoother, so you have no problems shaping it into a loaf shape. Depending on the stickiness of your dough, maybe you'll want to lightly flour the surface that you're shaping your dough on, but in most cases I use flour when pre-shaping, and then for the final shaping I usually don't need any more. After you shape the loaf, you just put it seam side down into your parchment paper lined loaf pan, cover it with something that will prevent it to dry out, and I usually like to put it in the fridge to do a long second rise overnight or even after the course of 1 or 2 days, but you can of course proof it on the counter for 3 to 4 hours, and after that it will be ready to bake. Right before you put it into a preheated oven, score it with something sharper that I'm using here. I really should change my blade. Cover it with another loaf pan and put it into the oven. Now this part is a bit tricky because loaf pans aren't really made to be put on top of each other. I know some people like to use clips to really get them to stay together, but I find that especially if you're operating with only 2 loaf pans, you can grab them in a way that you'll have no problem putting them into the oven. The baking time will vary slightly depending on the size of your loaf, and I've included more detailed instructions in the recipe linked below, but for the loaf I made with 400 grams of flour here, you'll want to bake it covered for about 30 minutes at 465 Fahrenheit, then uncover it and bake it for an additional 15 minutes at 430 Fahrenheit. Now my oven tends to run a bit hot, so if your loaf doesn't develop a nice brown color on top after 15 minutes, it's no problem to extend the uncovered baking time by 5 or even closer to 10 minutes. Make sure to take your loaf out of the loaf pan right after it's baked to avoid a soggy crust on the bottom. Make sure it's cool enough after you slice it to avoid a gummy crumb, and then enjoy it. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos about sourdough baking, food from scratch and natural living. I upload new videos every Friday and I hope to see you soon. Bye!